Let's take a plane, laugh at snowstorms and rain to Miami, where life is okay. You fly from frost to flowers in just 8 hours when you travel Eastern's great silver fleet. You make the clouds a byway when you take heaven's highway. In a moment, your fondest dreams complete. You fly from frost to flowers in just 8 hours when you travel on the great silver fleet.
For passengers and cargo over a contract route in the United States. Before we return to the era of commercial aviation's enthusiastic infancy, however, let's take a few minutes to look at an Eastern-produced film that takes a more pensive view of flight, from its primitive inception to the incredible state of technology that has put modern man on the eerily stark surface of the moon.
We have a dream, a goal, an aim and purpose which spurs us on. It's very simple. We want everyone to fly. In this country, past mid-century, on the threshold of a space age, flight seems a commonplace. Everyone and anyone who wants to can fly. Commonplace? To us at Eastern, perhaps. But how recent a commonplace? The history of man-made vehicles that fly is just a millisecond long in man's day on Earth. The span of time in which man has taken to the skies is brief, but man's dreams of flight are eons old. O human race born to fly upward. Thus the poet Dante hailed a dream embedded deep within our psyche, from the time the first man-like creature looked with envy at the birds wheeling and soaring in the skies above. Just as the imagery of sight is ever present in the blind man's speech, so the imagery of flight has always existed in the thoughts and speech of flightless man. The imagery of flight has enriched man's speech and storytelling as far back as memory takes us. Time flies. Thoughts fly. In flights of fancy, on wings of song and poetry. Prayers fly up to heaven. This imagery has given man a sense of freedom in his thought, and dreams of flight have provided that vision of physical freedom which man has always sought. As free as a bird. Myths and legends abound with tales of man's attempt to emulate the flight of birds through patient construction of huge artificial wings. Undaunted by the fate of Icarus, men of the Christian era attempted time and again to discover the secret of birds, to devise wings that would hold a man aloft, bird-like appendages he could manipulate with arms and legs. And brave attempts they were, though we can only guess how many dedicated dreamers met disaster among the wreckage of their artificial wings. We marvel at the versatility of Leonardo da Vinci's probing mind. The first true scientist in the history of flight, he made one basic miscalculation. It took an Italian of a later century to demonstrate that man's arm and chest muscles are much too puny to operate bird-like appendages. But that was centuries ago. Today, school children are told that the history of flight began in 1903 on the lonely Atlantic beach. Or did it? There was another time when men took to the air, and the world was swept with a fever as heady as the beat of revolutionary drums. The winds of freedom blew in many ways. Man made his first incredible escape from the confines of the earth over a century before Kitty Hawk. Excitement knew no limit, No astronauts of our own time received more delirious acclaim than that which greeted these intrepid balloonists. For the first time, man could look down godlike on the world below. New dimensions, new meanings of space and time were within his grasp. And way back then, people asked our own Benjamin Franklin, a witness to these first ascents, what use is it? Of what use, said Franklin, is a newborn baby? From that point on, the newborn baby grew lustily, and the annals of flight swelled. Annals filled with tragic consequences, as well as brave deeds. For tragedy, as well as exaltation, has always studded man's dreams of flight. As far back as Leonardo, scientists had considered the possibilities of heavier-than-air machines which man could control and maneuver. And the 19th century was a time of magnificent experiments and heartbreaking errors, of theoretical breakthroughs on the drawing boards and failures in the air. The work of many men in different nations was to culminate in the reality of Kitty Hawk. Sir George Cayley, Alphonse Pénaud, Enrico Forlanini, Clement Ader, Otto Lilienthal. At last came those two young Americans who put together all the findings of those who came before and embarked one cold and windy winter morning on man's first powered heavier-than-air flight. The air fever of a new era was upon us. Ludicrous, nostalgically quaint, perhaps. But danger was very much a co-pilot in the cockpits of those early makeshift contraptions, just as when the countdown starts for today's mighty blastoffs. December 17th, 1903. Wilbur and Orville fly for precisely 12 seconds. Now we are in the air age, and the birds, which man once envied, are pitifully outdistanced. And the passenger plane has become the dominant form of the world's transportation. Time, space, distance, absence, separation, return. These words and hundreds more are age-old. But we, you and I, and others like us in every city and countless lonely outposts throughout the globe, have given new meanings to these words coined in another era. Time, space, near, far, closeness, apartness, knowledge, understanding. The realization of man's oldest dream, the dream of flight, has given new dimensions to these age-old words. The dream has become a reality involving work, decisions, drudgery and detail, striving and planning, weariness and triumph, comradeship, and 1,000 small satisfactions from a job well done. These are the realities of a dream come true. Surely such realities are enough to fill our lives. Not quite enough. Without a dream, life loses a little of its luster. At Eastern, we still have our dream. It is a dream we share together, a dream that spurs our search for excellence, that gives an added strength to our commitment. Ours is a dream for everyone. Our dream is that one day, everyone will fly.
premise is stated. Eastern Airlines thinks that everyone should be able to experience flight, not only as a means of transportation, but for the very experience itself. How did it all start, this business of transporting people, mail and cargo, all over the world by an industry that has grown to the point where most of the major trunk carriers are listed in the top 500 industries by the financial community? To find out, let's return to an era when the great experiment, prohibition, was firmly entrenched, but just as firmly opposed by the Chicago bootleg gangs and thousands of speakeasy operators all over the country. When the movies still didn't talk, when Lindbergh was quietly preparing to become an international hero as the Lone Eagle, the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic. And other early aviators were the star attractions at state and county fairs all over the rural countryside, with their death-defying acts of wing walking and aerobatics in clumsy vintage aircraft. The 20s were a period of change and of determined efforts by a people to shake off the stern Victorian attitudes of their parents. Aviation fit this mood perfectly. It was exciting, thoroughly modern, and dangerous enough to surround flyers with an aura of recklessness and devil-may-care glamour. The air circuses were highly popular and served to enhance the public's awareness of flying. Practical use of the airplane also began during this period, when the post office established airmail service from Washington, D.C. to Philadelphia, using U.S. Army pilots and open cockpit airplanes for the purpose. President Woodrow Wilson was invited to see the inaugural flight. The sound of the JN-5 Army training plane, usually called the Jenny, could be heard in the distance by the handful of dignitaries as it approached the polo grounds in Washington. It landed a few minutes later, and the bags of mail were quickly loaded. There were no speeches, only the litany of the engine starting procedure.
Switch off.
Switch off.
Gas on.
Gas on.
Contact.
Contact.
The engine coughed, gasped, and smoked as a perspiring ground crewman futilely spun the propeller, but it didn't start. The spark plugs were checked, and another attempt was
Switch
made.
off.
Switch off.
Gas on.
Gas on.
Contact.
Contact.
Finally, someone thought to ask if there was any gas in the tank. The gauge read full, but the gauge was only reliable if the plane was level in flight. After checking the tank and finding it almost empty, they siphoned 20 gallons of gas from another airplane, and the engine roared to life on the next attempt. The plane was airborne. The presidential party left. But to the postmaster's horror, the airplane was headed in the opposite direction from Philadelphia. The plane landed in a field in Maryland, breaking its propeller in the process, and the mail was then carried by train to Philadelphia. In spite of this inauspicious start, by 1925, the Postal Service Department was regularly flying mail between New York and San Francisco, with 15 stops en route, something like an airborne Pony Express. The Kelly Act of 1925 authorized the Postmaster General to turn this task over to private contractors. But even though there was an appropriation of $500,000, there were few takers. More money could be made flying at county fairs. The post office felt that the mail should be flown at night in order to compete with the railroads. But pilots normally followed rivers or railroad tracks to find their destinations. One pilot, making an early attempt at night flying between Chicago and Omaha, requested bonfires be lit at specific intervals along the route. He took off, but never did see the bonfires due to bad weather. Under the Air Commerce Act of 1926, the federal government was to establish airways, set up air navigation aids, and draw up the first flying rules. Harold F. Pitcairn, a young flyer who manufactured aircraft for county fair exhibits and owned a landing field near Philadelphia, filed a bid to carry mail at $3 per pound. Pitcairn was awarded the contract to fly mail between New York and Atlanta, a distance of 792 miles. It is reported that Pitcairn had filed the bid as a lark, or at least half-heartedly, and was surprised to receive a signed and sealed contract. Prior to this, Pitcairn had never picked up a U.S. mail sack, nor had any idea what such a container looked like. He immediately began to develop an airplane especially designed for the task of flying mail. Enterprising businessmen learned that selling airline stock in 1926 was no easy task, since few people were interested in financing a new, not too promising fledgling industry. There were some, however. Major Reed Chambers, senior flight leader of Rickenbacker's famous 94th Hat-in-the-Ring Squadron, shared his wartime commander's bright dreams of what the airplane could do for peaceful pursuits. He was convinced that to develop new markets, businessmen would fly and they would ship their goods by air. Others would take advantage of the airplane's speed to fly to new vacation lands, thus made accessible. Chambers claimed that the big opportunity was for an air service that would take people and commerce of the industrial East wherever they wanted to go. Florida was the keystone to link us to the southern continent. Several New Yorkers of financial fame, Percy Rockefeller, Ann Morgan, Charles Stone, as well as Eddie Rickenbacker, discussed plans for an airline in Florida. With the post office paying $3 a pound for all the mail they could carry, a built-in traffic flow provided by Bowman-Biltmore hotels along the route in New York, Atlanta, Miami, Havana, the Florida real estate boom, and legendary year-round good weather, plus smooth air and no mountains, it would seem that an airline establishing service in this area would have a ready-made success story. In 1926, Florida Airways began one of the nation's first regularly scheduled airmail, passenger, and express services with one Curtiss Lark that flew from Miami to Jacksonville by way of Fort Myers and Tampa. Pride of the fleet was the addition of a duralumin monoplane produced by Ford and powered with a single Liberty engine. As for passengers, however, the public wasn't quite ready, and an employee of the Times was quoted as saying, "It was a rare day indeed when the company had one frightened customer in the wicker chairs we used for seats." The hurricane of '26 was the final blow. Florida Airways went into bankruptcy, and Pitcairn picked it up for a song. Early in 1927, production was begun on the Pitcairn PA-5 mail wing, a biplane powered with a 200-horsepower Wright Whirlwind engine. The route was surveyed and fields established at Richmond, Virginia, Greensboro, North Carolina, Spartanburg, South Carolina, and Atlanta, Georgia. On October 18th, 1927, nearly 7 months before Pitcairn's pilots had flown a bag of mail, the government called for bids for the carrying of airmail between Atlanta, Tampa, and Miami, Florida, a route of 619 miles. Pitcairn bid $1.46 a pound and was awarded the contract. Within less than 1 year, Pitcairn possessed a contract for an airmail route that had expanded to cover the eastern seaboard from Miami to New York, an air route distance of 1,411 miles. Pitcairn's mail wing met the contract requirements, but the inauguration of schedules was delayed several times, awaiting the installation of airway beacons. Finally, on the night of May 1st, 1928, the date that stands as the official start of the history of Eastern Airlines, Pitcairn Aviation flew its first pattern of airmail delivery flights. Because of an unusually heavy volume of mail, Pitcairn Aviation had to fly a double schedule of flights that night. 2 northbound flights departed from Atlanta, another northbound left from Greensboro, and 2 flights southbound to Atlanta originated in New York. While 5 trips were flown on the inaugural night, our company's annals credit Pitcairn Mail Wing number 21, with Captain Gene Brown at the controls, with actually being the first flight of what was to become Eastern Airlines. In August 1928, the airmail postage rate was reduced, and there was a 98% increase in volume. Need for larger mail-carrying airplanes was immediately recognized, and the first P-86 with a mail capacity of 550 pounds was placed into service. Mail carried that month was 12,759 pounds. Compare that to today's L-1011, which can carry 39,000 pounds of cargo on one flight. By May 1929, Pitcairn Aviation offered a daily except Sunday service, and the airline had grown to include 91 men, 13 of whom were pilots. Carrying the mail was so much more profitable than carrying people that most airlines with mail contracts made little effort to attract passengers. However, in April 1930, Congress had passed the McNary-Watrous Act, known as the Airmail Act. The new law brought about a change in the method of computing mail pay rates, which paid the airline for space instead of weight. This encouraged the airlines to purchase larger aircraft, using multi-engines and carrying passengers rather than fly half-empty. Meanwhile, President Pitcairn had decided to concentrate on the development of autogyros and sold Pitcairn Aviation for $2.5 million to North American Aviation. Four months later, on a Black Friday in October, the stock market crashed, and the airline might have folded had it not been owned by so large a holding company. The stock market crash, coming as it did in the closing months of 1929, brought an abrupt end to the frantic, fast-paced, fun-at-any-cost roaring 20s and served as a grim threshold to the depression-ridden 30s. As the financial panic expanded, banks were closed, and increasing numbers of businesses were closed down. Bread lines were an ominous sign of the times, and there's more truth than humor in the poignant popular song, "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime?" A bored but moneyless populace sought cheap new means of entertainment that also provided a chance to win cash prizes, and the roller derbies and dance marathons came into being. Motion pictures, which now talked as well as moved, were a vicarious means to escape the Depression, and the G-men were busily engaged in shootouts with the Dillingers, Bob Barkers, Bonnie and Clyde, and other new folk heroes of the 30s. At the beginning of this grim decade, on January 15th, 1930, Pitcairn Aviation became Eastern Air Transport Incorporated as a subsidiary of the giant North American Aviation parent company. In this huge aeronautical complex of 29 subsidiaries, plus 18 other aviation companies, Eastern Air Transport's corporate relatives included the Curtiss, Wright, and Sperry manufacturing companies, American Airways, Transcontinental Air Transport, United Aircraft and Transport Corporation, and Western Air Express. Sharing company quarters with the inventive Sperry brothers, Eastern pilots were soon learning to take directions from dials and gyroscopes instead of from the nerves centered in the seats of their pants. They were the first to demonstrate the automatic pilot on a transport plane. Instruments were deemed so necessary to commercial flight that in 1933, all pilots were required to pass a special test on instrument flying. Ironically, in spite of the stultifying depression of the 30s, the motion picture and radio industries, as well as aviation, continued to progress. Numerous technological advances were being made. For instance, an airplane equipped with a new directional gyro took off with a cockpit completely hooded, flew a 15-mile course, and landed blind at the starting point. The pilot's name was Jimmy Doolittle. Needless to say, this achievement represented a vast improvement over the navigation practices of most airmen of the time. Reportedly, there was one who navigated by cigar. He flew the New York to Cleveland airmail route and would light a cigar at a specified time after takeoff. When it had burned down to a 1-inch butt, he would descend through the overcast, and invalid service was slow to develop in the United States. Eastern Air Transport prepared itself to carry passengers and purchased 6 Curtiss Condors, 14 Kingbirds, and 1 Ford Trimotor. at a total cost that would not equal the price of 3 engines for today's jets. On August 18, 1930, with 11 cash customers, a spare tail wheel in the 12th seat, and 5 pounds of mail, Eastern Air Transport inaugurated the first passenger service between New York and Washington. These pioneering passengers suffered the indignity of being waved at from passing 4-wheeled Fords on the roads below who had no headwinds to contend with. In 1931, 15 cities were added to the system, and by the close of that year, Eastern Air Transport employed almost 500 people, owned 46 planes, and had carried its 10,000th passenger. By 1932, almost the entire length of routes had been lighted for night flying, with an airport or landing field every 30 miles, so that planes were never more than 7 minutes of flight from a landing field. In 1932, the company offered one-day service between New York and Miami, which permitted passengers to fly the length of the eastern seaboard, 1,200 miles, in one day. Leaving Newark at 8 a.m., it made stops at Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, and Richmond, where lunch was served. Passengers continued to Raleigh, Florence, Charleston, Savannah, and Jacksonville, where dinner was served, and they changed planes. After dinner, the flight continued to Daytona Beach and Miami, arriving there at 9:50 p.m., 13 hours and 15 minutes after leaving Newark. From Frost to Flowers in less than 14 hours. In 1933, control of North American aviation was taken over by General Motors, and on June 1st, Captain E.V. Rickenbacker became operating vice president. Captain Eddie, as he was fondly known, was already a legendary figure as a champion racing driver and America's most famous World War I flying ace, commander of the famous 94th Hat-in-the-Ring Squadron, with over 26 enemy aircraft to his credit. This fighting man had some very definite ideas on how an airline should be run. The losses had been great, and Captain Rickenbacker took over as the Eastern Division's general manager on January 1st, 1935, with the assignment of salvaging what he could of the General Motors investment. During a whirlwind trip over every mile of the routes and into every office, he got acquainted with every employee. He talked over the problems and promised these discouraged but desperately hoping men and women that he'd go to bat for them if they'd match his efforts and enthusiasm with loyalty and hard work. His first move was to cut out the frills in flying and slap on a rigid system of cost controls. To save rent, he moved the little executive family in with the parent, General Motors. To save on heating bills, he shifted the maintenance base to Miami. He swept out the last of obsolete Condors, Kingbirds, Stinsons, and Mail Wings, and got his hands on some new DC-2s. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep the airplanes in faultless condition. Then, between 1934 and 1938, the air transport industry suffered its greatest crisis. In 1934, the Postmaster General, James A. Farley, stated that in his opinion, existing domestic airmail contracts had been let illegally and issued the order canceling them. Immediately, Eastern Air Transport's night service was discontinued. To prevent interruption in the service, President F.D. Roosevelt issued an order directing the Secretary of War to furnish the men and equipment necessary to fly the mail during the emergency. 12 Army flyers, courageous but inexperienced in night and bad weather flying, lost their lives before this dark chapter in aviation history was closed. This was a high price to pay, but out of the experience came a national realization of the importance of the commercial airlines and also a revision and improvement in military flight training methods. Out of necessity, the government turned the mail operation back to commercial airlines. In order to qualify to bid on the new airmail contracts advertised by the Post Office Department, North American Aviation Incorporated organized a new corporation known as Eastern Airlines Incorporated. As dark as the Depression years were in most aspects, the 30s did find Eastern establishing some very impressive firsts. Eastern's perfect record during the difficult pioneer passenger years, 1930 to 1938, was recognized with the first Airline Safety Award. Eastern became the first airline in the world to be named a bonded carrier. The bonded status meant that goods coming in by air or steamship from any foreign nation could be transported via Eastern Airlines under bond for delivery at any interior city where there was a customs office. Eastern's weather department, formed in 1934, was one of the first non-government meteorology services established in the United States. It is considered one of the most advanced and reliable operations of its type in service today, and concerns itself with providing regular forecasts every 4 hours for the entire Eastern system.
Let's take a plane, laugh at snowstorms and rain to Miami, where life is okay. You fly from frost.
In the world of passenger travel, progress was also being made. By the close of 1934, it was from frost to flowers in just 8 hours. This reduction of almost 6 hours over the old flying time was made possible when 14 new DC-2s, the first of the famous Douglas DC series of aircraft to be used by Eastern, were placed into service. One of the problems that had to be solved in order to attract passengers to the airlines was to develop an airplane on which people would want to travel, an airplane that would be both fast and comfortable. The Douglas DC-2 met this criterion. This plane raised air transportation out of the mail carrier stage by furnishing reasonably comfortable travel at almost double the former speed and range of other planes of the time. Additionally, the 30s brought innovations in in-flight passenger service. For example, one airline inaugurated something quite new, airborne movies that were shown on a screen erected at the front of a DC-2 cabin. Another carrier boasted direct sleeper service from Chicago to Los Angeles with no plane change and only 2 stops. It was also in the 30s that stewardesses first appeared in the airlines. Ellen Church thought she could combine her skill as a nurse with her love for flying. She suggested the idea to Boeing Air Transport and got the job. A 1937 ad featured flight stewards as an exclusive of Eastern Airlines. But with the next war involvement, women were once again hired to add to the comfort and tend to the travelers' needs. Today, as you can see, we hire both men and women to be flight attendants. In 1938, General Motors decided to abandon its operating company in favor of its manufacturing interests. With war clouds forming in Europe, the doubtful airline was dropped so the corporation could concentrate on a more lucrative rearmament program. Although no one really wanted Eastern as an airline, it did appeal to some big corporations and banking houses as a piece of some bigger corporate deal. But with 3 years under Rickenbacker's stewardship, the sales price had gone up. One company made an irresistible bid of $3,250,000. By now, Rickenbacker was head of a cohesive group of men and women who called themselves the Eastern Airlines family. He was determined to save the airline for them, the people who had built it. In a thrilling photo-finish scramble, Rickenbacker, with the aid of friends in Smith, Barney and Company and Kuhn, Loeb and Company, managed to outbid some powerful financial interests and make good on its promise to save the company for the boys and girls that built it. The cost was $3.5 million. As a startling comparison today, an L-1011 costs over $17 million. During the short strike of 1937, many mechanics and maintenance men believed Rickenbacker was doing his level best to improve their working conditions and increase their salaries. Others felt they would be more secure with a union negotiating for them. After some research, Rickenbacker determined that the IAM was the best to serve his people and made an appointment with its president. The occasion probably marked the first time in labor history that the president of a company told a union leader he wanted his employees unionized. In 1939, Eastern inaugurated the world's first scheduled autogyro airmail service, which operated between Camden, New Jersey Airport and the rooftop airport of the Philadelphia General Post Office. This service was discontinued after 1 year's operation for the duration of the impending war emergency. Government officials call the experimental service an unofficial success. The decade of the 40s began with our nation gearing for war. Suddenly, the Depression was over, and nearly everyone who wanted to was working. But there was nothing to buy, as the nation's total hard goods output was devoted to armaments or military supplies. The motion pictures played to packed houses, but radio was the single most popular medium of entertainment. Top radio shows of the time were Jack Benny, The Shadow, Fred Allen, Fibber McGee and Molly, and The Lone Ranger, to name a few. Idols of the silver screen left the tinsel of Hollywood to don uniforms and enter the service, led by the king himself, Clark Gable. Others included Jimmy Stewart, Tyrone Power, and Lou Ayres.
Or nothing at all.
The big bands were playing to huge audiences at places like the Hollywood Palladium and Frank Daly's Meadowbrook in New Jersey, and each band had its own distinctive trademark and sound.
If your heart never could yield to me.
Tommy Dorsey, Glenn Miller, Harry James, Count Basie, Benny Goodman, and others. A new phenomenon, women at work, was highlighted in the song Rosie the Riveter, and the Andrews sisters were singing Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree.
Anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. No, 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 don't sit under
The war in Europe was growing, and before the 40s were over, it would become one of the largest wars known to man. The 40s would also bring about the atomic age and jet aircraft.
Anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. No, 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 don't go walking
In the early 40s, the airline agent worked reservation phones, sold tickets, and checked passengers in at the counter. He gave pilots landing information over the radio, received air freight shipments, picked up mail at the post office, announced arrivals and departures on the PA system, unloaded and loaded the aircraft, gassed the plane, added oil, de-iced wings and tail assembly when necessary. In one case, the agent went on board and worked the flight as a flight attendant because the flight attendant had deplaned and was too sick to continue the flight. Towards the close of the 40s, things changed. Jobs grew, and separate departments were set up. In 1941, Eastern employed 2,100 employees, had close to 6,000 route miles, and had carried 303,541 passengers that year. When World War II broke out in December of that year, Eastern Airlines was in a position of stability, which permitted it to go all out in assisting the war effort. When the war was declared, half the company's fleet of 40 airplanes was turned over to the armed forces. Eastern Airlines' Military Transport Division, manned by Eastern crews in special air transport uniforms, was set up to operate from Miami to San Juan and Trinidad, and was later extended to South America and across the Atlantic to Africa by way of Ascension Island. At the end of the war in 1945, the Military Transport Division was discontinued. It had carried 125,000 military passengers, 60 million pounds of cargo, representing 200 billion pound miles. Approximately 1,200 employees had been furloughed from the company to enter the service. Despite the fact that schedules were curtailed over a number of routes and the fleet halved by the war, increased utilization of remaining aircraft actually skyrocketed monthly scheduled mileage. For example, mileage flown in October 1942 was 67% higher than in October 1941. In 1942, through the war years, the 21-passenger DC-3 was the most modern land-based aircraft available for carrying customers with speed and comfort, with a well-equipped galley for serving hot meals. Then in 1946, when the war was over, the then magnificent DC-4, which had proved itself as a troop carrier during the war, was introduced. It was the first of the land-based airplanes that would carry large numbers of people. Until the DC-4, the largest civilian airplane capable of operating from inland airports could hold only 21 people. Now 56 people could travel on one plane, more than twice as many. It also had many special features, which were then considered very luxurious. 1946 was also the year in which we inaugurated service to Puerto Rico. The very next year, 1947, the 60-passenger Constellations were introduced. Besides carrying even more people, the passenger compartment was pressurized. Pressurization keeps the air in the cabin very much like the air on the ground. With pressurization, planes could fly at higher altitudes than ever before, thereby increasing the speed and smoothness of flights. With this airplane, the travel time from New York to Miami was again reduced. It was now from frost to flowers in just 4 hours. Over the next few years, the airlines kept adding new airplanes as the manufacturers tried to keep up with commercial aviation's ever-growing needs.
2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock. 9, 10, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, rock. We're going to rock around the clock tonight. Put your glad rags on.
During the 50s, America once again found itself in a bitter conflict, the Korean War. On the other side of the world, in a divided Germany, the Berlin airlift was a stubborn resistance to the attempts to blockade West Berlin. Bill Haley and the Comets introduced a wild new sound of music that came to be known as rock and roll.
We're going to rock around the clock tonight. We're going to rock.
And an electronic miracle, television, took the country by storm. Milton Berle, Howdy Doody, Ed Sullivan, Sid Caesar, and lots of very old movies were the TV fare of the day. Uncle Milty, as Berle was called, was so popular that in Chicago it was possible to tell when there was a commercial break in his show, for the water pressure dropped noticeably as people took advantage of the commercial time to rush to bathrooms and then rush back to their small screen sets when the show resumed. People throughout the country were talking about computers and the amazing speed in which they could figure things. By now, the reservations offices had been located in the downtown areas of the cities rather than out at the airports. This made it easier for women to become reservation agents, as they didn't have to commute to the airport. Here's a picture of one of the up-to-date reservations offices in the 50s. New aircraft were being introduced throughout this decade. The Martin 404 and the Convair 440, the finest two-engine aircraft built for traveling short distances. And the new giants of the Constellation series, the Super and the Super C, were acquired by the airlines. The DC-7B and the Super G Constellation were introduced to the public as the last examples of commercial development in the piston engine era. The Martin 404s had been put into service in 1953 to replace the DC-3s. The DC-3 has been called the workhorse of the air, and many of the 12,000 DC-3s built by Douglas are still in service today with other carriers. Eastern's last DC-3 was retired in 1953 and was selected by the Smithsonian Institute for its permanent historical display on the history of aviation. This particular DC-3 had logged some 53,000 flight hours. The Wright brothers' first airplane had logged only a total of 1 minute, 36 seconds of flight. By the way, the Pitcairn Mail Wing is also at the Smithsonian Institute. Colonial Air Transport, later Colonial Airlines, had won the original contract airmail route between Boston and New York in 1925. On June 1st, 1956, Colonial, which served Bermuda, Canada, and many upstate New York and New England cities, was merged into the Eastern system. In 1957, Eastern expanded its international service to Mexico City, and a new era of space exploration began when, traveling at a velocity of 18,000 miles per hour, Sputnik hurled into space. This was the year Captain Eddy passed on the title of Chief Executive Officer to a new president and a realignment of executive responsibilities for the jet age. Among the major changes which he effected in the company were the institution of a new customer services department, concerned primarily with the problems of the passenger from the moment he called in for a reservation through his ticketing, actual flight, arrival at destination, and claiming of baggage. Along with the improvements in the handling of reservations, ticketing, baggage, and meals in flight, great strides were taken in upgrading Eastern's on-time performance record. By May of 1961, Eastern was leading the industry in punctual arrivals, according to official figures compiled by the Civil Aeronautics Board. We crossed the threshold of the jet age in 1959 with the first jet-powered aircraft, the splendid, modern Lockheed Electra, a plane that combined propellers with jet engines. All of these things contributed their part, but they weren't in the form of steady, plodding progress. Suddenly, a miracle in the form of a big, swept-wing airplane without propellers appeared over the airline horizon. The Boeing 707 and the DC-8 made all the progress of the preceding few years, which had been considered substantial, seem unimpressive. Then came the Boeing 720 in 1961, which was a shorter range version of the 707. The air travel markets involved. On December 16, 1963, Mr. Floyd D. Hall became president and chief executive officer of Eastern. Since 1940, he had flown as a commercial pilot and in the Air Corps in World War II. Later, attracted by the challenge of the management side of the air transportation industry, he prepared himself through graduate studies in business administration while still flying. In 1957, he joined TWA's executive staff. He had become a member of their board of directors and senior vice president and systems general manager when he accepted Eastern's challenge. Through his fine human qualities, leadership, and effective management methods, he brought about dramatic changes for the better within 2 years. These changes were most evident in the company's overall efforts to provide better service to the public, and most importantly, in the enthusiasm and spirit of the 20,000 employees. In 1963, a new breed of aircraft was introduced to the public, the Boeing 727. This sleek, silent-running pilot's dream of an airplane was well received by the public and was soon aptly named the Whisper Jet. In 1965, the DC-9 brought the jet age to the smaller cities throughout most of the country, and the whole airline got a new look, as everything from airplane paint schemes to employee uniforms were dramatically upgraded in appearance. It was also in that year that the first Boeing 727 QC quick change jets were added to the fleet. In 1967, Eastern began flying the DC-861s, and later on, DC-863s would be added. This plane carried 203 passengers and a crew of 8. Eastern also obtained a route to Seattle, Washington, and through a merger with Mackey Airlines, we moved into the Bahama Islands. In 1969, the last piston-powered aircraft, the Convair 440s, were retired. Also, service to the smaller cities in New England and upstate New York was discontinued and sold to Mohawk Airlines. Today, they are served by Allegheny and was elected to the board of directors. The future. Compartment. To our fleet, the wide-bodied L-1011, known as the Whisper Liner. From 1903 up to today, aviation has grown tremendously. From the days of a pilot setting his aircraft down in a pasture and making his own repairs, to today, when a mechanic uses the most modern methods of analyzing the performance of a jet engine. From a simple instrument panel in the cockpit to this. From a reservation center like this to one like this. From a simple Coke and sandwich to this. From a simple loading procedure to this. There is little doubt that historians will record the airplane among the greatest inventions of all times, equal in importance to the first great transportation discovery, the wheel itself. This is probably one of the most exciting eras in the history of commercial aviation, as the fruits of research take form in ever more sophisticated and functional aircraft, facilities, and methods. Eastern is very proud of the part it has played in the development of modern commercial aviation, and will strive to enrich this proud heritage as the future of manned flight continues to unfold. You gotta be there.